Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Kate Nevin from the Commemorations Unit. I hope you can all see me okay and hear me okay. I am delighted to welcome you all to the special lunchtime lecture, 1920s Trailblazers, National and Transnational, part of the programme to coincide with the pop-up Women's Museum, 100 Years of Women in Politics and Public Life, 1920 to 2020. It's brought to you by the Department of Media, Tourism, Arts, Culture, Sports and the Gaeltacht and the OPW Dublin Castle. I'm just going to go over a few bits of housekeeping before I hand you over to Sinead for our introductions. This lecture will run for approximately 1 hour, including question and answer sections at the end. It is also being recorded and will hopefully be hosted on our department's social media at a later date. If you would like to ask a question, we ask that you select the Q&A button. It's just at the bottom if you hover over. There you can type in your question and we'll ask a few to the speakers at the end. We'll only be taking written questions today to avoid any background noise, and we won't have the chat facility on, so please use the Q&A. I'm going to hand you over to Sinéad McCoole to introduce our speakers. Enjoy.
Thank you very much, Kate. Kate Nevin is from the Commemorations Unit at the Department of Media, Tourism, Arts, Culture, Sports and the Gaeltacht, who going forward will be working with me on the women's strand of the decade of centenaries. 100 years on, we continue to rewrite the canon to include the role of women, to write a modern Irish history that's more egalitarian, balanced and whole. This was part of the cultural animation associated with the pop-up Women's Museum, which began in Dublin Castle earlier this year, and it continues on until the middle of October. It was created as a unique centenary moment, a pop-up Women's Museum, 100 Years of Women in Politics and Public Life. The idea for this exhibition came directly from the question posed during the centenary in 2016. Women came together, leaders in their fields. They wanted to understand the experiences of women in the Irish Free State and beyond. So it became a story not of a moment of centenary, but of 100 years that followed. It's been a joy and a privilege to be part of this official commemoration. Our first speaker, Kate O'Malley, Dr. Kate O'Malley, probably needs no introduction to our audience. Her work at the Royal Irish Academy and now at the Dictionary of National Biography, creating and finding great biographies so that we can look at new women from the past and the present. She joins us today to talk about some of the well-known women and some of the lesser well-known women. Her work over the decade ago on India and more recently on Ireland, A Voice Among the Nations, published by the Royal Irish Academy, the National Archives and the Department of Foreign Affairs, with her co-authors John Gibney and Michael Kennedy, is a book for book lovers, a beautiful object, rich with material culture, and is a masterclass in its use of documentation in an accessible way. I'm so looking forward to hear her speak. We are also fortunate to have Dr. Annemarie OBrien, following on from her publication this year of her work, The Ideal Diplomat, Women in Irish Foreign Affairs, 1946 to 1990. I thought of it more than once when reading her book of the distant days when working in UCD on women's documents, that we had none of these documents to examine in the 1990s. Her introduction goes to the heart of why we have to have a wider lens on women in public life over the past 100 years. Annemarie writes in her introduction, this book is concerned with the absence of Sheila Murphy, and Sheila Murphy was the first woman in 1962 to be an assistant secretary in the Department of Foreign Affairs. She writes, despite Murphy's diplomatic success, there is little or no mention of her in published narratives on Irish foreign affairs. And then Annemarie goes on to explain that it's the absence also of the personal papers and material. So for those of you who have looked at the exhibition and were or contributed to it, will know that it's so important that to collect this material culture. So I'm now going to hand over to our two wonderful speakers today, and I'm so delighted to be involved with this today, who are going to tell you a little bit more about wonderful women. Thank you.
Thanks, Sinead. I hope you can see my screen okay. Maybe Sinead, you could give me a thumbs up if my screen is sharing okay with the group. Super, thank you. I hope you can hear me as well. Thanks for the lovely introduction, Sinead. It's wonderful to be here. This is a new normal for us all, I suppose. It's just unfortunate I can't see all of the attendees' faces, but hopefully they will all enjoy the whistle-stop tour, I think is really the best way to describe what I'm going to do. It's going to be 2 parts, the talk, 20 minutes. So try and contain it to that. In the first half, I just thought, given it's the centenary of 1920, I thought a good place to start would be by looking at the McSweeney women, and in particular at Muriel and Mary, because their activities and indeed their names achieved worldwide attention in the wake of the death by hunger strike of Mary's brother and Muriel's husband, Terence McSweeney, in the autumn of 1920, 100 years ago. Terence McSweeney, obviously the Lord Mayor of Cork, who died by hunger strike. But Terence's hunger strike and death was a pivotal point in the revolution, and in particular on international perceptions of British rule here. And I think it's safe to say that the global audience would not have been attentive but for the activities of these women, and that's why I think it's really important to start by looking there. And then later on in the second half of the talk, I'm going to look at some well-known women, but some lesser well-known aspects of their active lives, Maud McBride and Charlotte Despard, and then at a woman who was a colleague of theirs who's not so well-known, a trailblazer in her own right, who has yet to make it into the dictionary actually of Irish biography, Sinead, although I have commissioned a piece on her, and her name is Molly Woods. But let's start first with 100 years ago at 1920. And if I just move down here, we've got probably a well-known picture of Terence McSweeney's wedding here with Muriel. I'm going to talk first of all about Mary McSweeney. Mary is a very interesting figure. Many of you will be familiar with her later anti-treaty activity. She was born in London, was 7 years older than Terence, a mother figure in more ways than one, in the sense that she had to move home to Cork after the death of their mother in 1879. But then in later life, she would also end up raising Muriel's daughter, Maura, from the age of around 13 or 14. Quite sad circumstances, but not the purpose of our talk today, but happy to take questions on that later. She and her sister Annie is in the dark hat, and then Mary is in the white hat. They obviously were well known for setting up Scoilíoga in their home in Cork in 1916. This was an Irish Ireland school along the lines of Pearse's St. Enda's. And it's safe to say that Mary was a trailblazer in educational circles. She really was involved in the schools throughout her life and was a well-respected educationalist apart from her political activity. She was considered warm, loving, full of humour, and is recalled as such by many of those who knew her. But obviously lots of people are more familiar with her dogmatic streak. And it must be said, historically, I think it's fair to say she was remembered more for this as well. She saw things in black and white, right and wrong, and was immovable in her political principles, no matter what the cost. And then Muriel, who's here, obviously in her wedding dress, Terence's wife, a good deal younger than Mary. And I think throughout this paper as well, age might be a factor. And if anybody wants to talk about that later on, I'd be interested in people's thoughts. Mary was equally politicised, or Muriel rather, but with a much more complex urgency, and perhaps brought about by an early desire to disassociate herself from her wealthy family background, who were of course the Murphys from the Cork's famous as the distillers of Cork. She was rebellious from a young age. Her family were really not happy with her gravitating towards nationalist circles and very unhappy with her marrying Terence. Interestingly, this photograph was taken when Terence was still interned in Frongach. This is in Barnyard Prison in 1917. And this was one day after her 25th birthday, because her family at least insisted that she waited until she got her inheritance so she would be financially secure before she married Terence. Although entirely supportive of the political cause behind Terence McSweeney's hunger strike, she did privately express her doubts and disapproval over it, and herself and the older Mary did clash about this. And this is hardly surprising when you think that herself and Terence had an 18-month-old daughter at the time. What I also find personally interesting in looking at the life of Muriel is that it's often her state of mind and her mental health that is a point of discussion and debate. She definitely suffered from depression. She did have electric shock treatment around these years. But I wonder really if it's her anti-Catholicism, her left-wing politics and her later atheism that was kind of played upon more. She didn't fit in, you know, in these circles later on. And so in early historiography, this is something that attention is often drawn to. And I just wonder about that. Anyway, to move on to how they became very active and why they were trailblazers at this particular time, it's safe to say, like I said earlier, that Mary, Annie and Muriel and their vigil, crucially at Brixton Prison when Terence was on hunger strike there, a bad move on the part of the British government. If that kept him in Cork, he may not have gotten the international coverage. The press were at the door in Brixton Prison when he was in hunger strike there. So it was lots of coverage that maybe wouldn't have happened either way. But it's safe to say that their vigil and the constant press coverage of them going in and out had a huge part in it reaching kind of that global scale. And then building on that momentum after Terence, really a lot of press coverage there as well, and indeed helped raise significant amount of funds for the Irish nationalist movement there, although Mary spoke about fundraising and her distaste for it, and she was happy to talk about recognition but wasn't so happy to kind of pass the hat around, if you will. This is a picture from the Library of Congress of Mary on that tour. And I think the really important thing as well, I know Annemarie will talk about this later on, is that they really were part of that early nascent Sinn Féin Foreign Service in their capacity at this time, touring America. And there are reports that they wrote home to the First Dáil and to De Valera, indeed directly in some cases from Mary Sweeney, that can be read on Documents in Irish Foreign Policy online. Really interesting insights into their many months long tour. In December 1920, Muriel then appeared before the American Commission on Conditions in Ireland, which was convened in Washington. And she addressed several meetings along with Mary in Massachusetts and New York. And really her story and the idea of her as a widow with a young child really was considered a damning indictment of British rule here. And she went on to become the first woman to receive the freedom of New York. Muriel returned to Ireland exhausted in January 1921, and she would go on a later tour in 22 on De Valera's instruction to raise more funds, but it was less successful. And like I said earlier, Mary, the older Mary, the sister of Terence, was probably better known for her later activity when she'd be one of the fiercest opponents of the treaty. I mean, famously speaking for up to 3 hours in the Dáil against it. She often invoked her dead brother as well in a lot of these speeches. And at this time, even by De Valera, she was considered quite the extremist, which is saying something. And as well, later on, she was arrested and imprisoned in 1922 by the Irish Free State and immediately went on hunger strike herself, aged 50. And I think they were really unhappy about the Irish Free State government at this stage about how this was really increasing that split that was having, that was going on at that time. Very divisive, and an awful lot of coverage by virtue of the fact that she was a woman who was the sister of somebody who had died on hunger strike. So a lot of coverage then on that. And then to segue into the second half of the talk, I just wanted to tell your listeners that I became interested in the McSweeney family as a result of my research in India and on Indian nationalism. And the reason for that is that it became a bit of a surprise to me when I discovered many years ago that Terence McSweeney's writings, which were published posthumously, were translated into tons of languages in India, and they had a mass circulation there, and this was just really intriguing to me. And in the 1920s and 30s, when India was still on its independence, on the road towards independence, we must remember India was a colony at this stage, Terence McSweeney's writings, as well as other Irish politicians' writings, were really, really popular there. And that's how I came to be more interested in the McSweeney's, just from the point of view of their Irish nationalism. But I'm going to move on now and look briefly at three other women for the rest of the talk. Two of whom you'll be pretty familiar with, I'd imagine. Little introduction, I think, is needed here to Maud Gonne, an Irish nationalist icon. But what is perhaps less known about her are her early contacts with Indian activists, particularly in Paris. She moved there on a more permanent basis in order to retain custody of her son Sean after her divorce. Now, we know that McBride did have dealings with Irish nationalists, or with Indian nationalists, really well-known ones actually, Subhash Chandra Bose in particular, who we'll come to a bit later. Calcutta Airport is named for him. He's really, really well known. But What is lesser known is that in Paris, she built up a friendship with this woman here, who's better known as Madame Kama. She's an Indian nationalist who had a lot in common with Dr McCoole because she was a tireless political activist who set up and edited nationalist journals, not just in India, but in Paris and Berlin. And then she arrived in London in 1901, but she had increased, was being under surveillance by the British authorities at that time, and as a result relocated to Paris. And that's how she came to know Maud Gonne. While in Paris, Madame Kama, who's probably better known in India today as one of the first designers of the first Indian independence flag, an early kind of prototype of the Indian flag of today. But while in Paris, she was smuggling revolutionary literature and explosives into India. So we're not talking about sewing circles and reading groups here. We're talking about really serious, pretty serious revolutionary activity, all being monitored by British intelligence. And so what we're seeing here in Paris in these early years is Maud Gonne McBride developed British India, and they were emerging at this time, and this would form the background to the establishment of an Indian-Irish Independence League some years later with the next two women that I'm going to tell you about. Again, Charlotte Despard, I think some of you should be very familiar with her, not as familiar perhaps with her as Maud Gonne. I find her a fascinating woman, eternally interested in her activities. There's just so much to talk about from her life. But I suppose just to give you a bit about her background, because it's relevant, she was born Charlotte French, married Maximilian Despard, a wealthy Anglo-Irish businessman, in 1879. And then after his death, about 10 years later, she began to devote herself to charitable work and became a poor law guardian for Lambeth. But over time, she became a long-suffering political activist and social reformer. And to give you an idea of the breadth of her political life, just to give you an idea of how long she was active, she was involved in the campaign for the abolition of the workhouse, in the fight for women's suffrage, in the resistance to conscription and the crusade for a negotiated peace after the First World War, and obviously, insofar as we're interested, in the battles for Irish and Indian independence. Interestingly, then finally, towards the end of her life, she became an ardent left-wing socialist, and she died a communist, a member of the Communist Party of Ireland. So quite a breadth there of activity, I think you'll agree. But in contrast, her family is interesting because she was the daughter of a Royal Naval officer, born and raised in Kent, although the family were of Irish descent. And her later membership of Sinn Féin and her relocation over here to Dublin during the revolutionary period were, to be frankly, the cause of a lot of embarrassment to her family, because her brother was Field Marshal Lord French, who had been sworn in at Dublin Castle in May 1918 as Lord Lieutenant and Viceroy of Ireland. So if they had dinner parties together, although I doubt they did, they would have had very interesting dinner party discussions, I think. So Despard commuted regularly to London and was in contact with a lot of Indian activists over there. So now we see the kind of network building up again. She became very good friends with the first ever communist MP, never mind Indian communist MP in the House of Commons. He happened to be Indian. His name is Shapurji Saklatvala. He was from her constituency of Battersea. And her main associate in Dublin was Maud Gonne. And you'll often see, when you're trolling through the photographs of Maud Gonne, you'll often see Despard with Maud Gonne. They were very, very close. They lived together for some years in Roebuck House before Despard purchased her own house in Eccles Street. And this picture here of Despard, I think, in 1932 in Trafalgar Square just is fascinating. And I just think it's a really impressive photo of any political activist, man or woman, in the 20th century. I think her authenticity and her strength is really shining through here. And you can see the men looking at her in some amusement, but also in some awe, I think, as well. She's quite a formidable woman and something to behold, I think, when you look at that. She was 88 years of age when that picture was taken. Now, finally, I want to move on to look at Molly Woods. Molly Woods is not very well known. Again, we can talk about age if anybody's interested. I think, because she was a woman in her 50s with an older family already raised, she wouldn't have been as glamorous or as interesting in terms of later histories, perhaps, that were written. But by the late 1920s, McBride was working in Dublin with Molly Woods, who also had Indian contacts. And that's why I've put up this picture here. This is Molly's family, and I'll explain to you the connections here. One of these chaps here is Tony Woods, who was later probably better known than Molly because of his involvement in the Civil War. He was on the anti-treaty side and in the Four Courts in June 1922. She was originally from Sligo, but the family settled in Morehampton Road. 131 Morehampton Road is still there. If you look at the fanlight over the door, you can see that they named it St. Enda's, and it's still there. This is around the corner from the O'Rahilly's house. Woods was a great friend of many IRA members at the time, and she was privy to an awful lot of what was going on in the revolutionary movement. I think in the witness statements, hers is one of the longest of the entire witness statements, which is quite interesting because her life and her political activism goes back as far as the Land League. And then at this time, during the War of Independence, she was actively working for Michael Collins, purchasing on his behalf, a respectable woman, an older woman, a number of HQ houses for him, one on St. Mary's Road in Ballsbridge. Whilst, like I said, the Woods' house in Morehampton Road became a very well-known safe house. She was a good cover. Liam Mellows recounted how Mrs. Woods' house was an open house to everybody associated with the movement. There were people always coming in and out, sleeping and eating there in all hours. I don't know how she fed them all, so that will just give you an idea of her activism. Again, curious to me how she's not as well known as perhaps she should be. But the Woods family, with their staunch nationalist and anti-treaty background, became involved in left-wing republicanism after the Civil War, especially Molly here, who was a prominent member of the Women's Prisoners Defence League. But she was also drawn to the anti-imperialist debate that raged through Europe in the aftermath of the war. And this is an interest that flourished, I think, as a result of the many Indian connections she made during these years. And her daughter, who's standing there, Eileen, married the Indian chap who's sitting on the ground there. His name is Tripura Day, and that's Eileen's father-in-law sitting between them. Tripura Day was an Indian medical student, and that's how they met here. So by the 1930s, what you have are these three women working together and campaigning, not just for Irish Republican with Irish Republican circles and platforms, but with Indian nationalists that were both based here and in London and on a regular basis. De Valera's success in the 1932 elections kind of contributed, I think, to a renewed fervour and clamour on the part of radical nationalists here to maybe bring over more Indian nationalists to talk on platforms. Despard actually, interestingly, had a very significant role in the run-up to the election in 1932. She could be found on step ladders at Cumann Gael candidates' constituencies with a trumpet shouting over them and telling everybody to shout for De Valera. And apparently, because of her age, she was never moved. So again, we have age is playing a part here. So Despard facilitated the passage over to Ireland of a well-known Indian nationalist called Vithalbhai Patel. This is a stamp of Patel, and there's an image here which brings in another well-known Irish woman, Countess Markievicz. This is the unveiling of the Countess Markievicz bust in Stephen's Green. This was one of his first political acts and public acts when he came here in July 32, when with De Valera he went to Stephen's Green and unveiled this bust. Then on the evening of the 8th of July, he attended a public meeting on College Green with all the three women I've mentioned already. And the Irish press estimated that about 3,000 people had attended, and there was great weight to Patel's presence when it was reported that the Indian nationalist leader in his picturesque dress and Gandhi cap was a central figure, and loud cheers went up as soon as they realised who he was. Now, this picture is a picture from 1932. It's not that particular meeting, not that I can confirm anyway, but if you look over here, you can see Maud Gaughan and Charlotte Despard on the platform, and this is the same location. So this is just to give you an idea of the types of political rallies that were held in interwar Ireland at that time. Just to give you an idea of the scale, really. The Irish press estimated attendance, like I said, at the Patel meeting of about 3,000 people, so a lot of interest. And crucially then, behind the scenes of the kind of front of house political activism like this, Patel was meeting these three women at night in McBride St. Stephen's Green residence. And that's when they were making plans for the organisation of the Indian Irish Independence League. And I should point out at this stage, all of this was being documented by British intelligence. And if you go to Kew or to the British Library, there are intelligence files documenting in parallel all of this happening. They really were concerned about Irish nationalists giving Indian nationalists kind of food for thought and fueling their activism at this time. There was increased coverage as well in On Public and in Irish papers, and even Indian nationalists came over from London and started contributing to Irish popular press about Indian nationalism. There was also an increased kind of boycott campaign in parallel with the Swadeshi movement in India. So you're really seeing an awful lot of interest in Indian politics at this time. And a lot of it, as I said, is as a result of the formation of this league. So right up until Patel's death in 1933, Molly Woods corresponded with them, and that correspondence is available to read in the National Library. There's copies as well in the Jawaharlal Nehru Library in India too. And then the League's most momentous task came a few years later in 1936, when, I know this is a grainy image, but I think it's wonderful because this is Subhash Chandra Bose, physical force nationalist, very well known in India. He comes to Ireland in 1936. Happy to take questions about this afterwards, but he is flanked by women, really. And you have Molly Woods here right beside him, who organised the trip, Charlotte Despard there, and Maud Gon McBride. Bridget O'Mullane is there as well. Again, not as much known about her as some of the other women. She was quite active at this time too. So in conclusion, I just want to wrap up by saying that I hope you've enjoyed what I'm describing here as a whistle-stop tour about telling you about lesser known aspects of some well-known women's lives. From a personal point of view, as a researcher, I found it really intriguing that women generally played a leading role in driving radical connections between Indian and Irish nationalists at this time, both here, but also on the subcontinent of India. I didn't get to talk about that, but women like Annie Besant and Margaret Cousins were really influential in the Indian Home Rule League over in India a few decades earlier. And so it's kind of a mirrored thing, which is interesting. And then I also found it surprising, I suppose, that more international aspects of some of these women's lives have remained kind of overlooked. And I think this is perhaps because, people have focused on their activism earlier in their lives, on suffrage in particular, and on the independence movement, but they didn't stop after suffrage was achieved. They didn't stop after Ireland became independent. Their activism continued throughout their lives, and I think that's really crucial to bear that in mind. And then many of the leading figures of India's nationalist movement looked to Ireland for inspiration in the years after 1916. And that such a really small country, so close to the heart of the empire, was successful in reaping freedom from their common enemy really ignited their interests. And I think that's proof of the pudding there is that dissemination, like I said, of Terence McSweeney and other Irish people's writings in India in the later 20s and 30s. But imaginations were ignited here too. And there was an immense appetite for Indian politics. And these women played no small part in feeding that hunger. Women during the revolutionary period and later helped make Ireland's story truly global. Their agency was more powerful than people realised then, and perhaps realise even now today. So I'll pass on to Annemarie, and thank you all for listening.
Thank you, Kate. I'll just share my screen really quickly. Make sure everyone can see it. Apologies, just one moment. Okay, everyone can see me, yes? Good, okay. Thanks a million, Kate, for introducing me. I'm not really sure how I meant to follow on from that. I'm sure we'll all agree that that was a really interesting talk, and I found your analysis of Molly Wood really, really interesting. Just as part of one of the women that I wouldn't have really known much about. But I will try my best to follow your lead. So just to begin, in the context of the decade of centenary, the role of women in the revolutionary period has featured prominently. So historiography, particularly from the last number of years, has offered new evidence on the role women played as active political and revolutionary agents in the struggle for Irish independence. Yet historiography on the transnational movement of women in this period is still relatively limited. So in this respect, I just want to thank Sinéad McCoole, Kate Nevin, and the other behind the scenes organisers for inviting Kate and myself to speak about some of the Irish trailblazers who campaigned for independence for an Irish Republic, both in Europe and across the Atlantic. So for the next 20 minutes or so, I will discuss the diplomatic activities of women in the revolutionary period. And like Kate, I kind of want to focus on some of the lesser known women in this period. So my focus will be on the central diplomatic mission of this period, which was Paris. And this was really the epicenter of Irish diplomacy from 1919 to 21. And in Paris, we have Annie Vivanti, Gavin Duffy, and Caoimhe Kelly. And like Kate's talk, this will also take two parts. So after looking at Paris, I will then move across the Atlantic to speak about, I suppose, a lesser known aspect of Irish diplomatic history, and I'll discuss the activities of Alice Janelle and Anita Bulfin in Argentina, both of whom have been largely forgotten in the history of Ireland's diplomatic network in this period. But first, I'll go to Paris. So gaining admission to and an audience at the Paris Peace Conference was the earliest foreign policy objective of the nascent Dáil Éireann in 1919. Sean T. O'Callaghan and George Gavin Duffy were appointed official Irish representatives. So O'Callaghan was the founder member of the Irish Volunteers in Sinn Féin, and Gavin Duffy, as some of you might know, was the former solicitor for Roger Casement in his 1916 trial. And really both were appointed, and many other men were appointed to diplomatic missions abroad because of their Republican nationalist credentials. But in Gavin Duffy's case, his linguistic skills and legal background were also particularly important. So upon their arrival in Paris, Annie Vivanti was employed as Sean T. O'Callaghan's secretary. Now, Vivanti was already at this stage a renowned Italian poet and novelist, and in 1907 she married John Charters. And John Charters would later be appointed Irish representative in Berlin, and he also accompanied the treaty delegation in 1921 as a secretary. And really, Vivanti was appointed to the delegation because she was a well-known figure in continental Europe. And she put the Irish delegation in contact with writers and journalists in Paris with whom she was friendly. And Gavin Duffy reported to Secretary of Dáil Éireann Diarmaid O'Hegarty that the only publicity you can count on here is what you can get through personally friendly writers and journalists. And this is where Mrs. Charters has been useful. So Vivanti cultivated contacts for the Irish delegation and communicated with high-profile journalists and politicians. And through her connection with Gabriele D'Annunzio, who was an Italian journalist and nationalist, Vivanti successfully organised a meeting between O'Callaghan and Benito Mussolini in September 1920. And this meeting really demonstrates Vivanti's effectiveness and influence in European political circles. And she worked towards the achievement of Irish foreign policy goals in a very unique way. In June 1919, Vivanti returned to Italy, but she continued to cultivate contacts for O'Callaghan and Gavin Duffy. In the same month, June, Mairead Gavin Duffy, who was the wife of George, travelled to Paris. Now, Mairead Gavin Duffy, who you can see here on the right, and this is a photo from the National Library of Ireland, she was a daughter of A.M. Sullivan, who was a prominent nationalist and journalist. And Sullivan was active in the Young Ireland movement, and in later years he became a Home Rule MP for Louth. But she really came to prominence after the Casement trial as Gavin Duffy's wife. So on the 17th of June 1919, Mairead Gavin Duffy arrived in Paris, and Diarmaid O'Hegarty wrote to Sean T. O'Callaghan, "It is very fortunate that Mrs. Gavin Duffy was able to get across. From what you say regarding your requirements, I have no doubt that she will be of great assistance." Gavin Duffy assisted the delegation in administrative duties. So she contacted journalists, she arranged appointments for the official representatives, but she returned to Dublin just 2 months later, opting to stay in Dublin with hers and George's 2 children. So while she didn't remain long in Paris, Mairead continued to act as a messenger for her husband back in Dublin, and she became the point of contact between Dáil Éireann officials and her husband. And I just want to kind of make this point that it's quite important that she did this, because it demonstrates the trust that was placed on her, not only by her husband, but the Dáil administration. And her commitment to the Republican cause did not go unnoticed. The following year, the Department of Foreign Affairs lacked a suitable man to take up a position as representative in Rome. And I say this because they always looked for suitable men, not suitable women. So they wrote to Mairead Gavin Duffy, and they explained that her husband was, quote, good enough to promise that you would look after the bulletin until Count Patrick J. O'Byrne could take up his duties at the end of the year. So George Gavin Duffy had actually offered Mairead's services without actually letting her know. So while I don't really have time today to speak in depth about her activities in Rome, the significance of her appointment should not be underestimated, and this is one of the reasons why I mention it. She had proved her Republican credentials, and she was clearly a trusted member of this select group of Dáil Éireann representatives. And it's also worth noting that her duties in Rome were not the usual responsibilities occupied by a diplomatic spouse. In all but name, Mairead Gavin Duffy was the official representative of the Irish Republic in Rome for much of 1921. But just to kind of go back to 1919, after Mairead Gavin Duffy's return to Dublin in August of 1919, the Paris delegation were without a female presence for almost a year. And the lack of a suitable administrative assistant and translator hampered their progress and debilitated their opportunities to promote Irish independence to prominent journalists and politicians. In 1920, Cach O'Callaghan, wife of Sean T, travelled to Paris to assist the delegation. Formerly, she was Mary Kate Ryan, and Cach was an active member of the Gaelic League, and she was a supporter of Sinn Féin. And some of you might know the Ryan family, and particularly the Ryan daughters, were actively involved in the nationalist struggle. So Min and Phyllis Ryan were stationed in the GPO during the 1916 Easter Rising, and they, with Cach, were arrested and imprisoned in Mountjoy prison in the aftermath. And while Cach was politically active, excuse me, she did not take an active role in the rising, but her name, Ryan, and her association with leading political figures made her a target of British forces. And really, both Mairead's and Cach's family dynasties provided the women with significant contacts within the nationalist movement. So Cach O'Callaghan travelled to Paris in the summer of 1920 to assist her husband in his negotiations with French officials, and she was particularly well suited for such a role. She graduated with a first-class honours BA in modern languages from UCD in 1902 and a teaching qualification from Girton College in Cambridge in England. And after gaining teaching experience in England, O'Callaghan returned to Ireland in 1909, and she lectured in modern languages. And her early years in UCD really kind of radicalised O'Callaghan. So Judith Harford has written extensively on UCD, and she has argued that the early decades in the life of the university were shaped by both its Catholic identity and its nationalist stance. Many of the early academics and students would significantly shape the consciousness of the emerging nation. So by the time of her return to Ireland, combined with further developments in Dublin in 1916, Cach O'Callaghan was a strong nationalist supporter. establishing her, what Roy Foster terms, her own nationalist salon at 19 Ranelagh Road in the succeeding years. And her nationalism, her training and fluency in modern languages were essential prerequisites for admission to the Dáil Éireann diplomatic service. So in the summer months of 1920, Koch assisted the delegation with their negotiations at the conference and more generally in influential Parisian circles. And like Gavin Duffy, before and after her visit to Paris, Koch acted as a messenger and a point of contact between Dáil Éireann officials and her husband. And she communicated instructions and policy to Sean T back in Paris. So evidently, members of Dáil Éireann had a certain expectation that wives would also promote Irish independence both abroad and at home. And it's unclear if Gavin Duffy and OCallaghan received a wage or a salary for their work, but it's my estimation that they did not. And the DFA really viewed their work as an extension of their husband's role. So that kind of, it kind of groups together all the three women in Paris. And I just now want to move on to Alice Canals and Anita Bolton. So similarly to Koch O'Kelly and Marie Gavin Duffy, Alice Canals accompanied her husband Lawrence first to Chicago when he was appointed head of the Labour Bureau for Irish Independence, and thereafter to South America when he was appointed special envoy to the Argentine and other Southern American republics. And I'm very sorry because I think some of my face might be actually blocking out Alice Canals' face, so my apologies for that. Alice Canals was also an active member in the Republican movement. They lived in England after the 1916 Rising, and Alice visited Irish Republican prisoners in Aylesbury, Wandsworth and Woking. And recalling the period of 1916 to 17, Helena Maloney wrote to Canals, and she said, "We all of us realised the great risk you ran, going from prison to prison, to get information about the prisoners, and the publication of that evidence was of great propagandist value to the Republic." Canals was a member of Sinn Féin, and on her return to Ireland in 1917, she was elected secretary of Cumann na Teachtair. She was also a member of Cumann na Mán and organised branches in Meath, Westmeath and Rathmines in Dublin. So therefore, her Republican credentials were quite well established when she and her husband set sail for the US on the 9th of July 1920. So by December of that year, Lawrence had established offices in Chicago where he distributed the Irish Bulletin, and he had started the Irish Relief and Reconstruction Fund. And there's very little information on Alice's role in Chicago. However, in December 1920, she recalled in her witness statements to the Bureau of Military History that she travelled to New York to ask Mary McSweeney if she would accompany her to Chicago to receive the freedom and hospitality of the city. And while in New York, she spoke to Harry Boland, who's the Dáil Éireann representative to the United States. And her access to McSweeney and Boland, both of whom were recognised as very prominent Republican figures, really demonstrates that Alice was held in the same esteem, and she possessed credibility within the Republican movement. So in March 1921, the Canals decided to take a speaking tour of South America. So almost exactly a year after they arrived in the US, they set sail for Argentina in July 1921. And they were very well received in Argentina. Almost immediately after his arrival, Lawrence was invited to Te Deum in celebration of Peruvian independence. He was invited to a number of public functions in Buenos Aires, and a number of newspapers published interviews with him. And Alice has really assisted her husband in these endeavours. She gave and attended receptions with Irish Argentinians and state officials. She fostered contacts with the Irish religious community in Buenos Aires. And most importantly, she managed the press and spoke to journalists about her husband's role in South America. And the couple's diplomatic manoeuvrings were successful, particularly among wealthy Irish Argentinians. And by October, they had launched the Dáil Éireann Republican bond drive. Canals was not the only woman, that was actually working towards Irish independence in South America at this time, however. Eamon Bolfin was appointed Dáil Éireann representative in 1919, and he was born and he lived the first 10 years of his life in Buenos Aires, and thus he had already established connections in Argentina. And Bolfin's sister, Anita, assisted him in Argentina in his work, and I think she was actually in Argentina before Eamon arrived. And she was particularly influential in launching the Irish Bulletin. Patrick J. Little was on a diplomatic tour of South America in 1921, and he reported to Robert Brennan, who is the Undersecretary for Foreign Affairs, the difficulties of establishing a press bureau. And consequently, Little decided to employ Anita Bolfin in this role, and he wrote to Brennan, "I found Miss Anita Bolfin had time and has the right ideas, and something of the family gift for clear writing." So it's very clear that the two women in Argentina had very different roles. Canals' role in Argentina was the traditional social role of a diplomatic spouse, managing her husband's engagements, while Bolfin provided the administrative and journalistic skills to the delegation. And additionally, at times, Bolfin also accompanied them to official functions because of her fluency in Spanish. Canal recalls an engagement in the city of Rosario in October 1921. A banquet was held for Lawrence, at which the Vice Governor, Mayor and Secretary representing the Chief of Police were present. And she recalled that, quote, "Because she could speak Spanish, Miss Bolfin sat beside the Vice Governor. At first he was a very difficult proposition because he felt that he should not have come. Miss Bolfin said afterwards, 'I think if I succeeded in making him talk, I could make anyone talk.'" So clearly Bolfin's linguistic skills were of clear importance at these social engagements in explaining Ireland's case for independence. And it's also very revealing in Alice Canals' witness statements and her accounts of her time in the US and Argentina that she describes the diplomatic activities in the plural. So she always uses we or us, and she repeatedly uses these phrases. So it's clear that she did not view these activities as her husband's alone, but as theirs. They were effectively a diplomatic team. And Canal really did play a smaller role than Gavin, Duffy, Vivanti, and indeed OCallaghan. But her witness statements support the argument that these women valued their roles abroad as representatives of the Irish Republic. They may have been posted abroad to accompany their diplomatic husbands or to visit them while they were abroad, but each had established independent roles in the nationalist movement prior to 1919. So they all had Republican credentials, I suppose. They brought specific language, administrative and public affairs skills to the Dáil Éireann diplomatic propaganda machine, and the trust placed in them with secret and confidential information was of vital importance. So the women I have discussed this afternoon were not the only ones to play a diplomatic role in the period, but they were certainly the first. And some of you might kind of better know Nancy Wise Power and Annemarie OBrien, who were employed in 1921 in an official capacity as press agents in Berlin and Madrid, respectively. And again, I don't really have time to speak about their roles, but I'm happy to take questions after about them. But their appointment does show a willingness on behalf of Dáil Éireann and indeed the Department of Foreign Affairs to employ women in the absence of men to diplomatic positions. The activities of Vivanti, Gavin, Duffy, OCallaghan, Canals, Bolfin demonstrate that Dáil Éireann actually expected their assistance. They helped to convey throughout Europe and South America Dáil Éireann's message that Ireland was an independent republic. They all contributed to the early phase of Irish foreign policy to varying degrees, and comparisons can be made between them. So they were almost all well educated, and some to university level. They were politically knowledgeable and actively involved in the Republican movement. Despite their qualifications and the Dáil's expectations, the administration did not intend for any of them to work in a permanent role. The intention to employ women temporarily, particularly until men could undertake the running of the diplomatic machine, demonstrates a certain disregard for the abilities and qualifications of these women. Despite this, they demonstrated considerable skill under very difficult circumstances, owing not only to the international situation in the post-war period, but also to their gender. And Fred Halliday has argued that nationalism seeks to mobilise women in support of its goals, independence, and the consolidation of a specifically defined post-independence regime. Throughout history at times of war, gender norms have been suspended and women have been called upon to help in the war effort. And this was certainly the case during Ireland's revolutionary period. Women were actively engaged militarily, politically, and indeed diplomatically. Undoubtedly, the women I've discussed this afternoon equally contributed to the Irish cause for independence. When Irish independence was officially established and the Irish state came into existence, the gender norms which had been suspended during the War of Independence were re-established and reinforced, and women once again returned to the private sphere. Consequently, the historical record has ignored their involvement, and they have actually become Ireland's forgotten diplomats. Thank you.
Very much indeed to our speakers. It was a really interesting lunchtime talk. I'm delighted with it. So today our event was in partnership with Dublin Castle Education Department, and a special thank you to Jenny Papasatiro for her assistance on that. It was originally scheduled for March of this year as part of our cultural animation programme. And I'd like to thank also Dr. Angela Byrne, who unfortunately couldn't be with us this time, who was scheduled to be with us in March. She was part of EPIC's Trailblazing women's exhibition, and she was also the one who came up with the title, so again directed how we were going to approach this. Thank you very much, Angela. So she's one of the what I would consider to be the early career historians, and I'd include Annemarie and Kate in that, whose work is adding so much to our understanding of the missing pieces of our history. I use that term deliberately, and some of you who are in the audience may actually understand or know where I'm going with this. In 1984, an ANCO project to set up for women in publishing produced a series of booklets on women in history. Indeed, a very rare set of publications that started a lot of this work in women's history, that's continued on and supported by the local authority coordinators during the decade of centenaries, who I have to give a shout out to there. It's very important that we have the work of academia, but we also have independent scholars, family historians and genealogies to add to our work. This has been a key part of the decade of commemorations, and indeed, one of the outcomes of the community engagement in 2016 was the constant refrain that the public wanted to know more about the women's story. And as a direct result of that, I suppose it's been assisted with the work that I have done for the department. I want to thank especially the descendants for the groundswell of their voices, who made the remembrance so meaningful and has informed all our work, not least by supplying of family archives. So I'd like to conclude by saying the objective of the Women's Pop-Up Museum, following an examination of what the material was in public holdings related to women in public politics and public life, was to demonstrate to those living, those activists who are still there, the importance of the archive and how historians use that archive constructing the narrative, and how women, even those exceptional ones, can be overlooked and forgotten. Thank you very much indeed, everybody.